Hi, my name is Dalia Yan, and this is my Flatiron School Ruby on Rails backend, JavaScript front-end application for Phase 4. This is where I will be talking about the code and the coding process that I went through, showing you kind of like how I was able to create this website, what I did, how I did it. So let me get to the coding. So I decided to create my application in one place, so I created both my front end and back end folders in one repository. Before this final product that I created, I had another project where I created my back end, and there was some disconnectivity to my GitHub, and so I decided that to avoid the headache, I would just take the back end that I created and move it to another application. Everything was fine and dandy until I was about to record my video and upload to GitHub for the final time, where I experienced the same error that I had before. So I took everything that I created in my second application and moved it to its final home, which is my third repository, my foodie. And this is where I'll talk about where and how I coded my application. So I started in my backend folder. I did my Rails commands to be able to download all of this lovely stuff. So I have here my models. So I have a city model and a restaurant model. My model has many restaurants. My restaurants belong to a city. That is pretty standard. For my application, I have my cities controller and my restaurants controller. So my cities, I didn't want to be able to create cities, so I just wanted a user, if they wanted to have an index of all the cities, or in addition to that, I wanted to be able to show them all of the cities I created. So the difference between using solely Ruby on Rails and integrating JavaScript into this application was that I had to render JSON to convert the files to be able to be seen in my front end folder, which was new to me. That was something that I learned about and something I implemented in my application. And then in my restaurants controller, I wanted to be able to create new restaurants and delete restaurants. So I created different methods. Again, the difference between Ruby on Rails and JavaScript is that I'm rendering JSON so that it can be used using JavaScript. And then a difference that I realized was in my setting params, I didn't have to require params, I just had to permit it. So that was something that was different for me on line 37. Those are my controllers, those are my models. In this application, the difference is that we're not using view files. The whole front end of my application is built in JavaScript, so that was different for me. I created my 2 migrations. I wanted to implement something else in my application, but I didn't get a chance to. And I have my seed files here. I also have, let me see, my routes are just cities, only cities, and then my restaurants. That I didn't want my users to be able to edit the restaurants, which is why I excluded that. What else? That is basically the gist of setting up my back end. I did have to play with some gems and just include these gems. I ended up not using Faker seed data, so that was one difference for me in making this application. And then I got to my front end. So the first kind of things that I made was I made my style sheet. This customization came later, but I created this file because I wanted to have it already placed in my application. My index file, my index JavaScript file, and my index HTML file. What you see here allows for this lovely website right here to exist. So this index file along with my the style sheets. This is what gives it customization and everything that you see on my website. So in my index JavaScript file, I created a new instance of my city API, which is all the data I have for my local host, which is right here. So you see when I open up Rails S, I get a list of all the cities that belong to all the cities, and then the restaurants that belong to them. And then I also created a constant or a variable for my form, which is I'm getting that element restaurant form for my index right here, and I created the ID restaurant form, which is what you see at the bottom of my web page here. My restaurant form, that's how that was created. I also don't really I do require this actually. Line 3, my constant header, get element ID by header. I'm also rendering that. Is just the header that I created at the top of my application, and then I'm also loading the data from my city API in the backend folder to be able to load that into the document. So I'm also calling this new instance of the city API with the getCities method, which I'll talk about in a moment. And for my form that I created above, I added an event listener just for the user to be able to submit the data. And then on my restaurant API, which is the list of all the restaurants, I'm calling the submit form method, and I'm binding that with my restaurant API. So what that essentially does is that all the restaurants that a user decides to create using the submit form, it binds it to the database so that every new restaurant is added over to my restaurant API, and that is the gist of my index JavaScript file. I will get into how I rendered both the city and restaurant API information from my city. I created a constructor method that took in the base URL, which I believe I set in my city. Takes in the base URL, and it sets it equal to the URL that I'm fetching from, and then from there I make a fetch request, which is a promise to the application that takes in the argument of this base URL that I'm fetching information from, and then there's a then method which takes that as a response as a JSON argument, and then on line 10 takes JSON, and then for each JSON it takes another argument of a city object, and then I created a variable called sit on line 11, and that is a new instance of city taking in that argument of a city object. And then on that sit variable I'm calling the argument of getCity, the function that I created in my city JavaScript folder. So before I move on to my city, I'm just going to talk through my restaurant API section of my application. So on line 3, I again create a constructor, takes in the argument of my base URL, and I'm setting this, which is the restaurant API dot base URL set equal to the base URL, just taking in that data from the back end. I created a function to delete my restaurant if I chose to. So that delete restaurant takes from the argument of the ID, because every restaurant has a specific ID. From there, I am just connecting with the back end on line 10 and telling the application the method that I'm going to implement on this ID of the specific restaurant is delete. And then from there, I have a fetch request, which takes in the base URI, specifically the restaurant ID number, and then it calls that delete method on it. From there, JSON kind of like descrambles what the user just did, and then on line 14 it alerts the user of the message that they have deleted the restaurant of their choice. On line 17, I have another function, submit form, which takes in the argument an event. From there, I just create different variables, my form, my restaurant name, nationality, city rating, city dropdown, and I am extracting that element by their ID names. Right here, I am creating my params to dictate what info the user is able to submit to the document. So I just have my constant, my variable called form data. I'm setting the name equal to the restaurant name, which I called on line 22, and I'm setting it equal to that value, that key value pair. I do the same for nationality. I created a variable above, so I set it to the restaurant nationality and the value that belongs to that. Same for rating and city ID. And then right here, again, the way I did with my delete method, I created another variable called config my object. And what I'm doing for that is I am telling the front-end application the method that we're going to be using for these forms that I'm submitting is the post method. So once I create it, I want the new restaurant to be submitted to the website. And that kind of also, it does happen from lines 46 to 53, where I'm fetching the request of this base URL, and I'm also config object, and then I'm calling the method then just get that response. It's a JSON response. From there, I'm setting a new variable called new res, which is an instance of my new restaurant that takes in the argument of JSON, which is the response. I also created a new variable called city, which just extracts the element from my document. So city with a new restaurant that has a specific city ID. So if Katz's Deli belongs to New York City, then it knows that that new restaurant has a city ID of 1 because New York City is the value of 1. I created another variable called append restaurant, which just adds that new restaurant that is created and calls the get restaurant method on that, which happens on line 51. Following that, I take the document by element ID, which is my city, and I append that variable with my appended restaurant, which is a new restaurant that got the new city. And then from there, just to reset after a user submits their form, I called the reset method on my form so that the new restaurant that can be created has a clean, fresh slate for it to be able to input the data. So that is kind of what my restaurant API does. I will talk to you about what my city class does and why I have it here. So my city class is all the methods related to my city. I'm extracting my restaurants from this city class in the methods that I created. I think something I didn't talk about was how it might be in a controller. Okay, so right here on line 5 and my index of all my cities, I wanted to include the restaurants that belong to those cities. So if we look here, let me open it over here. Okay, so we see my cities. We have a list of New York City, Madrid, and we see the restaurants that belong to them. Because I called the get restaurants, well, I include restaurants when I render all of the cities, that when I look at my backend, I see that each city has a list of all the restaurants that are belonging to them included in that list. So that is how that happens. And then in my restaurant params, I'm also passing in the city ID, which is what the restaurant belongs to, as a parameter of creating a new restaurant. So back to my city JavaScript file, I have a constructor method that allows me to take the class of the city and I set it equal to the name, to the ID, to the restaurant. My getCity method allows me to extract the city list from the document. On line 13, I just create an element called div, which I wanted to extract the city list from all the other mumbo jumbo in my HTML file. I created a class list. For my city div element, I called the class list on it to create a new class list. So you can see in my index HTML when I call my my list of cities, you see that the class is called city list and the ID is set city list. That is how, if you see the flow of my page, I have my header, I have my list of cities, and then I have my new restaurant form. So when you look at my web page, my header, my list of cities, and my new restaurant form. So that is the class list, names, so city list for that city div element. And then I have another variable called city info where I'm calling the this.getCityInfo, which is below on that variable. And again, because I'm getting my restaurants from the list of cities, I created another variable called restaurants, and then I call getCityRestaurants on that variable. And then I appended a child, which was a kind of difficult concept for me to understand from my knowledge. When I call append child on something, it takes the argument that I'm passing in and kind of adds it to the parent. So that's what that does. I'm just altering my city div and I'm adding the city info to that. Again, with my city list, it has my city div added to that and my restaurants added to that. From lines 27 to 31, I'm getting my city info, which is just extracting the list of city names from that list in their own div element. So my city data in our HTML is this .name. If I were to add like pizza to this, or pizza with a missing Z, you can see how it changes that the list of city names has pizza added to them. So that's just how I'm able to get the list of the city names extracted. Then I return the city data, just returning it back to what it belongs as. This is my getCityRestaurants method where I extract the restaurants from the city list data. I created a variable called restaurants, an unordered list, because that is what I wanted to create it. I wanted every list to just not have a number assigned to it on the web page. I set the ID of that restaurant unordered list to city.getThisID because every restaurant has a specific city ID, so I just want to call that as a good way for me to organize my application. And I added a class list to this restaurant unordered list, which is called restaurants. And then for each restaurant on that list, I created a new instance of that restaurant, so I destructured what that restaurant was so I can make changes specific to the restaurants. I created another variable for using that new restaurant, and I'm calling the getRestaurant on that, which I will show you in a moment. And then I appended that list that I created to my restaurant unordered list. And after I did all of that, I returned my restaurant unordered list back to its original value, which is just an unordered list of restaurants, which you can just see right here. You see they don't really have a number because I chose not to. So if I chose to change my styling of this, it would have bullet points, but I just wanted it to be clean without bullets. So that is an unordered list. I think lastly, on my front end, I will go through my restaurant class, and talk about what that does and how that works. So I, on line 1, created a variable called Restaurant API, which is a new instance of my Restaurant API. Just the local host page of restaurants, so a new instance of that list of restaurants. I created a constructor method, which takes in the inputs specific to the restaurant, so the restaurant ID, name, nationality, rating, city ID. I set it equal to this restaurant. On line 15, I start my get restaurants, which allows me to get that restaurant data specifically from my city API. I created new elements such as line and a delete button for myself. I also created just how I wanted to be able to call that information. So on my restaurant list inner text, I called this name, so just the name of the restaurant. And I also created class lists so I could alter certain things that I wanted to on this restaurant list. So I added restaurant data and restaurant addition. Right here I created another constant, or a variable that is set equal to a div element. On that variable I created a class name called hidden restaurant data, which is this information here that is hidden to the user unless they chose to look at it. And I also added a class list to this called hidden. And then what I wanted the user to be able to see when they clicked on that element was the rating, which is in addition to the restaurant rating, and the nationality, which is whatever nationality the restaurant is, which is on these lines right here. And then after that, I appended the restaurant data, which is that div element of like the nationalities in the restaurants, to the restaurant list. So this data belongs to whatever restaurant that it correlates with in this list. So I created an event listener, which was difficult for me because I kind of struggled with calling the right things where they needed to be. But what my event listener does is it listens for a click, and if the restaurant data contains the hidden, then in my console, so in my console, which you won't really see unless you choose to, you'll see that it's connected, click, and then it removes the hidden element, so you're able to see what the restaurant data is. And if it's hidden, then you will not see the information, and in the terminal it'll just say hidden, and after all the clicking it just returns back the restaurant list. So I can show you how that works right here. Okay, I clicked on Misty's. We see here that it's clicked, connected click. I click on it again, and you see it's hidden now. Stanford's Astoria, connected click because the data is showing, and it's hidden now. That's how that event listener works. Beneath that, I created the ability to delete an element from my restaurant list. I created a class list for my delete res, which I defined above, which is the button, the red button that you see. It's called delete button. And in that inner text, I made an X, which is what you see here, this lovely little button. Right here, I added another event listener, which listens for the click of my mouse. And if it hears that click of the mouse, then my restaurant API, which is a list of all my restaurants, implements the delete restaurant method, which I did right here. Delete restaurant, which just connects to my backend, it deletes it behind the scenes, and then it removes that restaurant listing from the list. From there, my restaurant list is appended with the deleted restaurant, so the restaurant that I deleted above and it's been removed. This list of restaurants was appended with whatever value of the restaurant that was previously there is now gone. And then it returns back to my restaurant list with the deleted restaurant off into the back end, never-ending hole. That is how my application's connected. I can talk to you a bit about styling. I just have a lot of resources that I read, and I saw how to do different things, and I had an image of how I wanted my application to look in my head. It didn't really work out that way. I didn't intend for it to look the way it does, but I do like the way my website looks. I did a lot of reading about like hidden elements and how to make lists better and buttons better and to implement headings. And if you watch my previous videos, you can see what I've done in the past and how this website and its page styling is completely different from everything I've ever done. Before, it looked like a website out of 2001, but with styling. There's color, there's liveliness, there's vibrancy, and that is really just how I coded my application. It took me a while to understand like how everything is connected from the back end to the front end, but overall I'm glad with what I've done.